To talk about Barbie and Oppenheimer at the same juncture, not as a cultural event, but as two movies independent of each other, would be on one hand to betray the very conceit of the Barbie-Oppenheimer phenomenon in the first place. The two polar opposites, ironically unified on the same day by fate, a possible vendetta from Warner Brothers, and lightning in a bottle virality, were never meant to truly engage with one another. But on the other hand, by some unknown virtue, which has at least something to do with simply being products of a similar time and place, they inevitably share undeniable DNA. In fact, Asteroid City, which I covered a couple weeks ago, forms a perfect Venn diagram between the two movies, uniting the dollhouse and the nuke. That video was also largely about AI, which is the villain of the new Mission Impossible, so clearly this summer in movies has demonstrated a collective fear of opening Pandora's box, of unleashing something into the world with irrevocable consequences, and watching it grow and become fully self-fueling. In the case of Oppenheimer, we watch Pandora, in this case likened to Prometheus, open the box and reckon with his actions. And in the case of Barbie, we live in the box itself and see what happens when it opens up and chaos tries to be put back in. As for Mission Impossible, both of these things are kept on the periphery, and it's up to Greek demigod Ethan Hunt to track down the box and destroy its contents. So that movie's primary relationship with the box was getting boxed out of the box office this past weekend. This was mainly the result of poor release timing, which is a shame because I actually had a great time with that movie, and do believe it's in many ways an antidote to the current state of blockbuster filmmaking. But I think that displacement also speaks to how Mission Impossible ironically had the easiest swing out of them all, reckoning with this beast in a conventional hero-villain framework, whereas Barbie and Oppenheimer both tasked themselves with truly impossible feats. One sought to challenge the social conventions created by its own subject, while still being an uplifting experience and pleasing its corporate overlords, its villain being the very thing that allowed it to exist in the first place, and the other sought to navigate the complexities of post-war geopolitics and ideological relations in the US from a British filmmaker with a history of navigating clunkily around acts of police and state violence. Considering the needles that both movies had to thread, it's a miracle that they both largely pull it off. The other impressive feat, which both stacked the odds against these movies and also directly contributed to the mass intrigue in them, is not just their distinct auteurist visions, but how these specific movies branch off from their given director's previous work in alienating ways. Barbie, as a sociological study of the box observing its contents as one would an ant farm, follows up the sentimental warmth of Little Women and Lady Bird with an ironic plastic sheen and at times blindingly deep focus, sharing more in common visually with Lazy Town than with any of Greta Gerwig's previous movies. And Oppenheimer, observing the psychology that would lead Pandora to open the box with deep pathos, follows up two mostly impersonal movies of large-scale action spectacle with a cerebral courtroom drama shot on IMAX, zeroed in on its lead subject to an unprecedented extent, with focus so shallow it often struggles to stay fixed to its subject. Both movies took visual risks in portraying their risky perspectives, and in both cases, it pretty much paid off.
And I'm bad like the Barbie. I'm a doll, but I still wanna party. Pink felt like I'm ready to...
Even before Greta Gerwig took over Barbie, the movie was always going to challenge the beauty standards Mattel is responsible for, stemming from Amy Schumer's involvement. That vision would have been a pretty simple declaration that anyone can be Barbie no matter what you look like, and maybe 10 years ago that would have made a lot of money from a specific demographic, and it would have fallen to the wayside as a byproduct of a cultural moment we were long past, even by the time Schumer got involved. Not to say it's passé to challenge beauty standards, but as a culture, we're well aware on a much wider scale now that that approach to revisionism still plays into corporate interests and maintains their control, despite appearing like an upheaval. But Gerwig saw something in the Barbie framework that at once respects the importance that the message about self-worth has to Mattel's primary demographic, young girls, and still reckons with it as a weapon of corporate interest and culture wars. This paradox is the movie's greatest strength, and the source of its greatest pitfalls. I think the key to understanding Barbie is to look at White Noise, the most recent Gerwig-Noah Baumbach collaboration before this one. While that movie uses the timely, COVID-esque airborne agent as a catalyst that, on paper, serves as a conventional inciting incident, its main focus is on a more general existential dread being repressed under pop consumerism. The film operates with a deep irony in how the the characters interact with the consumerist world around them, and it ends with an ironic dance number in the grocery store, as an ode to the notion that we're all gonna die and we live in hell, but we're gonna try to find meaning in it regardless. It's clear that with Barbie, Gerwig and Baumbach are still wrestling the same demons, and here they've found an even more apt subject to express it through. With White Noise, there's an inherent awareness that it's playing to a stuffy, critical demographic, and as such, never stood a chance at even approaching its $100 million budget at the box office. Which is to say it never had any commercial promise, and embarking on such a destined-to-bomb crusade became an act of revolt against the consumerism critiqued in its own text. This is to say it attacks consumerism from the outside. Barbie takes this ethos and flips it around, trying to evoke the same anxieties amid consumerism by being a proper consumerist product and piece of pop media itself. Rather than watch someone react to the consumerist products around them, the dread is now inherently infused into the product itself. Both Barbie the character dealing with this dread as an in-world commercial toy, and Barbie the movie dealing with this dread as a real-world commercial product. For this gambit to work, it had to be, for all intents and purposes, a successful blockbuster musical comedy. And I'll be damned if that's not what it is. It exploits the toy mechanics and cultural touchstones of Barbie, like destroying a doll or Ken's homoerotic reputation, and plays those things for genuine comedy. I laughed more than I have in a movie in a long time. Some low-hanging fruit here and there. I won't try to defend the Snyder Cut joke, but a proper comedy needs these different registers and swings and misses to hit actual highs, which is what so many comedies are afraid of, and why the genre has had such a tough run in recent years. Robbie and Gosling are obviously great, but the whole cast is extremely inspired and well utilized, with several key players who are often hit or miss for me, being mined for their precise abilities and shielded from their limitations. If you can believe it, I actually thought Simu Liu was pretty decent as a smarmy piece of shit. The movie also wears its influences on its sleeve. Gerwig and Baumbach as arbiters of taste now, pulling from the likes of Jacques Demy and Vincent Minnelli, with big studio dance numbers and colorful, blatantly artificial sets, infusing this movie that was gonna be a hit no matter what, with the aesthetics of older films now associated with the TCM Criterion Collection crowd, you know, the kind of people who would watch White Noise, and refamiliarizing the pop culture with that language. It has the same kind of tongue-in-cheek attitude about these sequences as something like Hail Caesar, but it's much more sincerely part of the film's DNA, and there's at least as much genuine appreciation as there is in-joking. That's not to say all of its references are sincere though, because it also chews up and spits out a ton of media with the kind of irony that injects a shot of poison into this delectably frosted cake. 2001 pastiche, West Side Story pastiche, The Matrix pastiche. I mean, there's enough here to call it an Austin Powers pastiche. One of the common fears going into this movie was that it would just be Barbie the Lego Movie, or Barbie Enchanted, but we're so distanced from the Lego Movie by now, and the fish out of water element takes up so little of the movie before we go back to Barbie Land, that these things can be chalked up to pastiche too. These references work to varying degrees of success, 2001 working especially well in setting up Ken's indoctrination later in the movie, and the Matrix moment falling a little flat. But this brings me to the biggest pastiche of all, the movie's overt waxings on second-wave feminism, which is where it primarily tries to have its poison cake and eat it. Or eat its cake and simultaneously have it, or have it too, or eat it too, whatever. If you've watched this far and haven't seen the movie yet, I'm just gonna lay out the plot real quick. Spoiler warning. Basically, Barbie Land is a staunch matriarchy, and Ken is an incel for Barbie, and after following her into the real world to learn why she's having existential thoughts, he learns about patriarchy and brings it back to Barbie Land, and all the Kens rise up and try to take over. It's a little bit like if Don't Worry Darling were actually a good movie. So America Ferrera, who plays the woman sort of responsible for Barbie's existential crisis, gives an uplifting speech to unbrainwash the Barbies, and the contents of that speech I can only describe as a pastiche of Laura Dern's Virgin Mary monologue from Marriage Story. Then the Barbies travel around Barbie Land and give similar speeches to all the other Barbies, and this is how they regain the autonomy to fight back against the Kens. One can imagine that these kinds of conversations would have been the meat and potatoes of Schumer's Barbie movie, and they're played out in full force here so that any uncynical minds, read the young girls who were the movie's initial target audience, can hear them and be genuinely uplifted. But the context of these conversations obviously changes the sentiment of them a little bit, because here they're largely used as political fodder to secure one mutually exclusive system over another. It certainly respects the straight-faced value of this rhetoric, invalidating Barbie's existence and performing life-affirming sentiment, and not just for the Barbies and the girls watching back home, but even for the Kens defining their lives outside of the patriarchy and making that sentiment universal. But the movie is very cynical and tongue-in-cheek about winning back the Senate and, oh, maybe one day Kens will have as much power as women have in the real world, which is of course taking a jab at the effectiveness of voting in the real world. I think this also draws a line between all women are queens and gaslight gatekeep girl boss, which is to say between naive but well-intentioned blanket statements that may not be groundbreaking commentary but don't hurt to repeat, and the co-option of feminist ideas to keep the system churning. I think the movie, for the most part, is able to reckon with this and stay one step ahead of that poptimistic rhetoric, not delivering it at complete face value, but still ultimately being uplifting and validating. You could say it's performing meta-modernism with feminist theory, but the gambit does eventually run into a wall. You can only deliver so much self-reference about being a corporate product searching for something more until you loop back around into being a corporate product, and Mattel is well aware that being based and self-deprecating sells now, so of course they're more than happy to be the target of these shots. The movie even explicitly addresses this, but it results in a liberal sense of ostensible change that fundamentally still maintains status quo, no matter how much they lampshade around it. Also, Barbie the toy is forced to be a commercial product, whereas Gerwig, whose roots are in no-budget independent filmmaking, has been vocal about her decision to stay in the uber-budget blockbuster world. That's not a judgment of her character. As Richard Brody stated in his back and forth with Amy Taubin, selling out isn't entering the business. And it's true that Gerwig's received more scrutiny for taking the blockbuster route than many other blockbuster filmmakers who started out in the indie world and now work for massive corporations like Apple or Amazon. That's largely just accepted as the moral tax of working in Hollywood, and on a broader scale, it's the obvious consequence of art under capitalism. Part of the flack towards Gerwig is just the fact that she's been a great independent filmmaker and people don't want to see that part of her voice packed away. But I also think flying so close to the sun textually and almost providing a meta justification within the product invites scrutiny upon itself. There's a fine line between learning to love the bomb or providing life affirmation within an unshakable system and contributing to the system itself and justifying that sense of complacency. This is what I mean when I say that irony is the movie's greatest strength and greatest weakness. But I maintain that the movie is mostly able to have it both ways. There's a lot of potency within the world they've constructed for more micro-commentaries that aren't necessarily contradicted by this whole thing being a corporate product, and I do think the experiment of searching for meaning within the pinnacle of commercialism largely worked. I had a great time, at least. It took me by surprise to hear the story that Robert Pattinson gifting Nolan an Oppenheimer book on the set of Tenet is what sparked his active interest in the man, because you can see Oppenheimer's influence on Nolan as far back as the arms race that is The Prestige. The nuke and nuclear anxieties have directly informed much of his work, and even way earlier, Nolan demonstrated a relationship between art and physics that it seemed only Oppenheimer shared. So despite a prior fixation on the nuke, I imagine reading a proper biography is what got him to realize that they're two sides of the same coin. In Oppenheimer, which I'd place confidently in the biopic as autobiography genre, Nolan makes an active point of showing Oppenheimer's artistic awakening, a man more inspired by the likes of Picasso than the legendary physicists he'd end up working with. He thinks in cosmic, abstract images, and as a theoretical physicist himself, he refers to his work as being too abstract, using terms that overlap between the worlds of art and science to describe these processes. In doing so, Nolan paints him as an alienated figure, an artist within a world of scientists. Nolan himself has always proven to be a scientist within a world of artists, facing a similar alienation despite helming some of the most successful blockbusters of all time. The two worlds, of course, are not mutually exclusive. His interests in chemical film processing, time dilation, and rigid geometric editing have taken him further in his art than his more humanist and empathetic efforts, and his past few films being more formal exercises than means of storytelling first and foremost, have ironically allowed him to be more expressive of his core self. This may be a counterintuitive comparison, but I think of him in many ways as belonging to the same camp as Eric Romer, who made the furthest thing from blockbusters, but expressed a similar blockade between mathematical concepts and philosophical principles and human expression. Interstellar, which is one of my favorite Nolan films, performs a delicate dance between this dichotomy, and though it contains maybe his single most clowned-on line, I think it's his strongest ode to the disconnect he feels only being able to express himself behind the Romerian wall of scientific and mathematical concepts. So this being the case, Oppenheimer was an inevitable pursuit for him, and it seems on paper like the only viable vehicle for him to take that interstellar cry for help and go even further with it, as in this case it resulted in one of the single greatest catastrophes in human history and the defining moment of the modern era. To put it plainly, I ended up being a little more lukewarm on Oppenheimer than most people seem to be, and certainly more than I wanted to be. I don't dislike it by any means, and there's some brilliant material in there, but for such a grandiose subject that seemed to embody everything essential about Nolan in one convenient housing, I was honestly surprised and frankly dismayed by how much I was able to shrug off the whole experience of it afterward. I think the very alienation that drew him to the project is what makes his approach here counterintuitive. On paper, a scatterbrained montage bouncing all over parts of Oppenheimer's life to present a portrait of him that's not necessarily objective, but shows us the whole picture in the macro in a Dr. Manhattan sense, or in the Cubist Picasso sense, sounds like the perfect union of form and function for Mr. Nolan. The very opening of the movie has a montage of explosions with a quote likening Oppenheimer to Prometheus, per the book Nolan is working off of. And as this opening unfolded, I felt a truly evil pit in my stomach open up, like Nolan had formally tapped into the spiritual rot that birthed the nuke and its real-world mythological significance, and I was ready for the next 3 hours to build on that feeling. But after the first 15 minutes or so, it loses that energy, aside from a few other moments sprinkled throughout, and the rest of the movie becomes a Sorkin-esque interrogation of the ideals that led to the principal event. Rather than math and science becoming Nolan's barrier from the art world, or art and abstract cosmos becoming Oppenheimer's barrier from the world of physics, words become the barrier between the audience and the kind of spectacle we expect from a Nolan film. We see the Trinity test in full force, and we see Oppenheimer imagining the effects and aftermath of the bomb, but the entire last hour of the movie is devoted to discussing the fallout. Even the actual bomb dropping on Hiroshima, in keeping with Oppenheimer's perspective and the barrier of words, we only experience through a radio broadcast explaining the event. Now, all of this I totally respect, but it leads me to what I can only theorize is responsible for my own lukewarm feelings towards the movie as a whole. It's funny that the one thing people were worried about with this material in Nolan's hands was actually handled pretty well. As a political indictment of the nuke, the movie navigates around a pretty vast array of perspectives and dialectics, with nothing but disdain for US officials, and it's sympathetic to Oppenheimer's communist affiliations, turning the whole Oppenheimer indictment into the kind of witch hunt that would make Arthur Miller proud. And then the line from Miller to Aaron Sorkin to here becomes very clear. My issue isn't with the fact that so much of the movie is a courtroom drama, or that they set us up for spectacle and pull the rug out from under us. I'm all in favor of turning minutia into spectacle and shooting endless conversations on IMAX and expanding aspect ratios at the drop of a court order. My issue has more to do with the apparent lack of focus these scenes reveal. For better or for worse, Sorkin is a master at making us realize that a moment or relationship that seemed insignificant earlier in the story is actually pivotal in informing our lead character's principles and both emotional and philosophical decisions. There are moments in Oppenheimer where Nolan does this, but for instance, when he starts to associate Oppenheimer's guilt over the bomb with his betrayal of the Communist Party, and more specifically his betrayal to Florence Pugh's Jean Tatlock, this recontextualization doesn't make his relationship with Jean feel any more profound or emotionally significant, because the relationship was so minimal and there was such a lack of emotional core between them to begin with. He doesn't have much of an emotional core with anyone for that matter, which of course plays into the alienation he experiences. Robert Downey Jr.'s Strauss is technically the villain of the movie, but Oppenheimer doesn't think about him at all. But I think leaning into that alienation makes it impossible to buy into any of these relationships as actual emotional or philosophical linchpins in Oppenheimer's indictment. After all, we can still see profound emotions and shortcomings in the emotionally stunted Mark Zuckerberg from similar reveals in The Social Network. And despite navigating the politics of the event with tact, on purely a level of rhythm and syntax and efficiency, Nolan just doesn't have the same panache as Sorkin, or Oliver Stone for that matter. Another clear influence, who in his prime was able to be extremely heavy-handed about things without the dialogue itself sounding clunky. Nolan is also inevitably prone to his Nolanisms here, and I laughed at moments like mentioning a wormhole in the apple, but some of the cheekier stuff, like the JFK name drop or Oppenheimer suiting up, just don't really feel right here. I guess they fit the reading that The Bomb is the Dark Knight trilogy and The Fallout is the current landscape of superhero movies, but that's more of a secondary reading anyway, and I think it often undermines the gravity of what we're watching. But maybe I wouldn't mind the clunky dialogue-driven stuff so much if Nolan didn't demonstrate for us every so often that he is in fact capable of using his spectacle-making prowess to achieve the level of eldritch horror that the material so ripely invites. The Trinity test sequence is one of the best set pieces he's ever constructed, and the subsequent speech he gives where he imagines the audience as victims of the bomb while they're all cheering him on is a standout as well, which makes the courtroom stuff, where to me he seems very much out of his depth, land with that much less force. Again, I respect not showing the bomb drop, and I understand why so many of the decisions were made in service of Oppenheimer's subjective experience, but they just didn't entirely hit for me. But like I said, I didn't hate the movie by any means, and there's a lot I really loved about it. Great ensemble cast with great performances, even if so many characters were underwritten. The sheer level of recognizing so many actors, even in such small roles, is probably another thing that plays into the commentary on the superhero landscape and cameo culture. But if it really wanted to criticize that phenomenon, it shouldn't have done such a good job of actually pulling it off. And one of the strongest aspects of the movie is just how smarmy and straight up evil some of the US authority figures are presented. Obviously Truman, as well as James Remar talking about his honeymoon in Kyoto, and Casey Affleck showing up as a jump scare. Nolan has figured out a lot of brilliant imagery, particularly the raindrops on the water and the black gloved hand. And of course, the IMAX footage is spectacular. Whenever it expanded into full IMAX ratio, and you could tell the clarity of the image changed, I truly felt like I was looking at some of the most pristine images I've ever seen. I do want to see the movie again, not just to try and have a more emotional experience with it, but also to see how the different formats vary from each other. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be like another 3 weeks at least until there's an open seat available.
Jazzy, Stacy, Icky. All of the Barbies is pretty. Damn.
So apples to oranges, of course. But I have to say, I'm a little surprised which movie handled its political elements with more tact, and which one succeeded more comprehensively as a sensory experience, for me at least. Two completely opposite approaches to Pandora's Box, but if nothing else, I think there's something to be said for Barbie as a movie about asexual dolls with no genitalia, and Nolan as a largely asexual filmmaker trying his hand at explicit sex scenes here, and delivering truly some of the most horrifying moments in the movie. I don't know if that point warrants discussion. I certainly couldn't find a place to fit it in either of those segments, but hey, what can you do? This has been the Barbenheimer experience. Let me know how yours was. I'm sure you have nothing but lovely things to say to me in the comments. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.